Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I want to delve into a deeper topic, a little bit heavier of a topic, and I know we can do it. So I'm glad you're here for it. And it's a topic that society kind of tucks away, doesn't talk about much, and you're supposed to just kind of act like you're fine. And that topic is grief. It's something we all experience, and as ADHD women, we tend to feel things very deeply. And so I feel like this is an important thing for us to really unpack because when we're in a state of grief, it can stop everything else, right? I once had an evidential medium who I talk with regularly, Kim Weaver. She talked about when the grief is super heavy, the connection to the other side is like they're there, but we can't feel them as much or they can't feel us as much because there's like this almost like a cloud of grief. I'm, of course, paraphrasing what she said, so I'm just not directly quoting her, but this is my understanding of what she said, that there's this cloud of grief that connects us from spirit. And that's important for connecting with our loved ones or people on the other side, but also connecting with our highest self or, our deep soul self or whoever you consider that inner wise woman inside of you. Because when we are in a state of grief, it is hard to feel truly connected to who we really are. And that's important as entrepreneurs because we are the business. We are the light that attracts people to us. And if we are shut down in grief, it can be really, really hard to show up in our business in a way that attracts people to us. And so I want to unpack this topic. Part of why it's coming up for me right now, my mom died almost 5 years ago. It'll be 5 years in February. And her 75th birthday would have been this week. So just thinking a lot about her and, how loving she was. She was someone who really saw my struggles, although there wasn't a name for it back then, or I guess there was a name, but it's not something they called girls ADHD, right? And she did the best she could to help me with it. And so she's a really special person and being now. And I've been working through new layers of grief as I get to the 5-year point, but around me, I'm noticing so many people faced with just big losses, whether it's divorces or kids moving away or lots of death too, like lots of loved ones dying, whether it's friends or parents or in-laws, things like that. And it just seems like there's just a lot of it right now. And, we could get into the state of the world also. There's some grief there if we choose to be aware of what's going on. So certainly this topic seems to be just coming up and being heavy on people's hearts. So I want to take some time to talk about it. What I want to say first, before we dive into it, is that grief is like an emotion like any other. It's really a set of emotions. And the thing about emotions, and you've probably heard me say this, is emotions are messages from our body, right? They are neurochemical responses. It is our body's way of saying, yoo-hoo, I have this feeling, do something about it. And, when it's something like anger, it's like, yoo-hoo, I'm angry, boundary violation, like set a boundary, protect, or whatever. Or when we're happy, oh my gosh, this is great, do this more. And so our feelings aren't bad. Remember, they're emotional communicators. And grief has just a whole bucket of feelings that go along with it. You'll hear people talk about the stages of grief, which was never meant to be linear. Kubler-Ross, who developed them, was actually developed them working with people who were terminally ill. And so it wasn't even actually about people who had lost someone. It was about people who were going to lose their life. And it was never meant to be linear steps, but you'll hear about the stages of grief. And what I can tell you in my experience, what I've witnessed, just going through it myself with my mom, but also holding space for others, is that those stages can be happening all at the same time, or I remember flipping through denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, or depression or whatever, all at the same time or on the same day. Like I'd start out being like, did my mom actually die? Because when someone dies suddenly, which was the case with my mom, and unexpectedly, that period of disbelief can be extended. Because like if someone's terminally ill, it's kind of like, okay, well, they've been ill for a while. I mean, unless they just were diagnosed a couple weeks ago and then they die, like that's different. But like if they've been ill for a while, that disbelief factor, it still happens, but maybe not for years after. Whereas with a death that is more of a surprise, uh, it can, I will tell you, I still occasionally have disbelief. I had some yesterday. My family was going out to celebrate my mom's 75th birthday. And in the car in the morning, I was like, wait, what? She's not going to be there. I mean, she'll be there in spirit, right? She loves to show up for parties in spirit. But I'm like, wait a minute. Did she really die? Did that really happen? And so I want to name that for those of you who've had a sudden unexpected loss. I'm sure this could happen in the case of an unexpected divorce or something like that, But I found especially true with death. It's like, wait a minute, I can't just call them. And I remember it taking me at least a year or two before I stopped asking my partner at the time, like, my mom died. And I had to remind myself that I hugged her dead body. And I had to remind myself that there were 170 people at the memorial, so that it was like, okay, yeah, that wasn't just a big group of people like getting together to trick me and my sister into thinking our mom was dead, right? Like, I know that sounds kind of morbid, but it was something I had to go through. And it might be like, why are you sharing this, Jen? Well, I'm sharing my experience because grief has some commonalities to it. And so if you're someone who had this unexpected loss, you might be experiencing some of this. And so some of the ways of working through the disbelief can be reminding yourself of like, okay, yeah, yes, I saw their body. I mean, if you did, right? Or yes, I attended their memorial. Just to help you be able to remember, and then having people in your life to remind you. Other pieces of emotions that come up with grief, and again, it doesn't always have to be a death. I'm talking about that because that's what's fresh on my mind, both for myself and really like a few of my friends and a bunch of clients. Like it's just all around me right now. So I'm sharing the death experience as an example, but this can apply to everything else. But there's for sure sadness, right? There's for sure sadness that comes up. And that's important to recognize and to sit through and work with. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might work with that sadness, what we might do about it, because feelings are meant to be felt. Remember, they are our body's sign of saying, yoo-hoo, something needs to be dealt with here. And it's not enough to fix the problem. I mean, first of all, there's no fix for grief to my knowledge. Like, yes, I can meet with a medium and talk with my mom, which, by the way, if you don't believe in that, that's okay. I do. And even if it's not real, I don't care because I still feel like I'm talking to my mom, right? It's like, okay, it's like good enough. But if someone dies or if someone divorces you and you didn't want to be divorced, like there's no fixing that. Like there's just some stuff that's not fixable. And even if there was a fix, like let's say you're angry and you set a boundary. Well, that fixes it going forward, but you might have to work through some of the initial anger for the violation that occurred. So grief, the same is true. We have to work through all the feelings that show up. And I'll talk a little bit later about what I mean by work through the feelings. Alan Wolfelt, he's a grief expert, wrote a book. Oh, I'm not going to be able to remember the book, but it's something like I don't remember. I couldn't even tell you now. Understanding Your Grief or something like that. And his name looks like Wolfelt. So Wolfelt, Alan. Anyway, he really talks a lot, and this book helped me a lot. He talks about active mourning. And what he's really talking about is feeling the feelings, letting yourself sit with them, letting yourself work through them. And that could be your sadness, that could be anger, It could be being with the bargaining you do, like, okay, mom, if you just come back, I promise, I don't know. I promise I'll manage your stress for you or something, I was like, okay, right. If that was possible, or people bargain with whatever God or spirit energy they believe in. And so there's all these different pieces that we need to work through. And before we go to the feeling part of it and working through it, I do want to talk a lot about acceptance as part of the grief process. And I want to name, at least for me and the people I know, acceptance isn't the goal. It's not like this final landing point where you're like, okay, yeah, this person died, or yeah, I'm divorced, and okay, yeah, I'm okay with it. I mean, you'll have feelings of that occasionally, even early on. I mean, maybe not super early on, right? It took me maybe 3 to 6 months-ish before I was there. I can't quite remember, but you might have glimpses of it, of being like, okay, yep, this is real. Okay, I don't like it, but okay. Yep, okay. And that doesn't mean all of a sudden there's no more sadness or disbelief or anger or bargaining, right? It just all cycles through. And I work with someone who had a major loss about 20, I think we're 27 or 28 years ago now. And I still see her funnel through the different emotions and experiences of grief. I like that word, experiences, better than stages, but especially around the anniversary of the big loss that she had. Like, I see the sadness, I see the anger, I see the acceptance eventually again. And even, I don't know about disbelief anymore. I think she's pretty clear. But I watch it and I know that these things never really go away. Grief changes us, right? And it doesn't have to be that we're sobbing every day, all day for the rest of our life. What I find is the people who don't actually work through their feelings, and like I said, we'll talk a little bit about that, are the ones that end up just horribly depressed and sad most of the rest of their life, is because they didn't find a way to actively mourn around the time when it happened. And to be fair, there are times when our grief is postponed, right? Had I been in graduate school when my mom died, I don't know how much I probably would have had to take a semester off, truth be told. But I don't know how much active mourning I could have done. My sister has kids. And then one of my longtime friends, when her mom died, about 19 years ago, she had I think a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So she wasn't sitting down at night like I was, writing to my mom and writing to her mom and listening to Hertz music for grief, right? She was lucky to get 5 minutes to go to the bathroom alone. So I want to also name that how you actively mourn is going to look different for the stage of life you're in. And the capacity you have. Some of it depends on what your life was like before. If you've had a really hard life, you may not have learned how to work through big feelings. And so all of a sudden you're hit with this big loss and you're like, oh my gosh. Or you have a complex situation where it's a parent dies, they're the one who abused you, and either things were somewhat talked through and resolved, or they weren't at all, and maybe you were speaking to them, maybe not. That creates extra layers of stuff because your experience is going to be different than mine. Because my mom was a very loving person, and I could see how she really, really loved the heck out of me and my sister and did her best. Was an amazing mom in a lot of ways. So I want to just name that all of our experiences are going to be different. So Alan Wolfelt actually says, grief is unique as a thumbprint because it's different for everybody. It's different for everyone. So just know that as I'm sharing my observations in other people, as I'm sharing my own personal experiences, that your experience is going to be unique to you. And so the way you work through it is going to be unique to you, which can sound scary, but there's some kind of tips and tricks maybe I'll share. Seems like a weird phrase to use when we're talking about grief. But I want to say one more thing. Stephen Kessler actually added a experience of grief he added a sixth one. And before Elizabeth Kubler-Ross died, he had worked with her back in the day, and he checked this out with her. And it has to do with like meaning making. So like, for me, this came as a therapist. I didn't realize how bad I was at helping people through their grief till I had a bigger loss. Like, I mean, I'd had a couple grandparents die and some pets. And don't get me wrong, I love my grandparents, but they didn't raise me. And so having my mom die was like, oh, wow, I really suck at holding space for grief. Like, I just had read all the textbooks and was doing that, and a lot of it's wrong. A lot of it has this timeline for grief. And, oh, if you've had grief for more than a year, now it's complicated grief. And it's like, what? Grief is lifelong. Like, I know that until the day I die, I will miss my mom. It's going to happen, right? And I may not sob all day, every day like I did before, in between client sessions, on the way to work in the car, on my way home from work in the car, at home, right? Like it's not going to look like that. It doesn't look like that now, but it will still be there. And so at the same time, this meaning making has to do with like, I found that through having my mom die, I have learned how to companion other people in their grief, how to actually be an effective therapist and coach for people inside of their grief. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather suck at helping people with grief and have my mom back. Like, for real, no offense to my clients, love y'all, you're great, in a healthy therapeutic boundary way. And I would rather like have her back because she was that amazing for me. So this last piece is not about like, oh yeah, okay, I'm okay with her being dead because now I can do this. No, I mean, that doesn't have to be something you're ever okay with. But Kessler uses the example of Patty Wetterling, which if you're in Minnesota, you're very familiar with Patty Wetterling. When I was about, I think I would have been 14 or 15. I think I was 15. Jacob Wetterling was a boy, I want to say he was like 10 or 11, who was kidnapped in a southern Minnesota town, and no one could find him. And like forever, it just was like went on and on. And so Patty Wetterling, his mom, created a foundation for missing children, and they've helped find all these children over the years, or at least locate them if they've died. And so like she turned her grief into action. And I will say that story ends quite sadly. They did find him only because the guy who was in prison for something else agreed to tell where Jacob's body was as long as he wasn't prosecuted for his murder, and could have some other stuff benefits while he was in prison, right? So that's really gross and yucky. But they did, at least they were able to bury their son after, I think it was after like 30 years. So maybe longer. But my point about Patty Wetterling is not that. I mean, certainly that is sad and that's worth noting. But she was able to help other people, right? You see this all the time. Like when my mom lost her friend to uterine cancer, she would do the, I can't remember the name of the fundraiser, but it was a walk for uterine cancer. And every year she would do it after her friend died. And so that catapulted her into action to help, right, in honor of her beloved friend. So I just wanted to mention that is an added experience of grief that Kessler brings us. So he actually has a whole book about it, but I kind of just told you the deal. But again, I just want to reinforce that none of this has to happen on a timeline. Things can happen when they happen. You know, as a therapist and as someone who's dedicated to my own healing and growth throughout my life, especially once I was in my early 20s, I was aware of like one of the things that usually helps me is if I can understand the lesson in something. That is one of the things that helps me get through pretty much everything. Like when something sucks or whatever, I'm like, all right, well, at least I'm gonna learn something from this. This isn't my first choice, but here we go. But I remember that thought coming into my brain like about 3 months after my mom died, and I just heard this loud no. Like, we don't give a shit what we're learning. We just want her back. So it was I wasn't ready for that. So I bring this up because it's really important that you honor your own pace with grief and loss. Okay. So I want to say a little bit about what can happen if you don't deal with your emotions in general, but especially grief, right? Brene Brown in Atlas of the Heart talks about some of the more difficult emotions to deal with. Grief is one of them. Despair, shame, rage, those are there too. I believe, is it helplessness or hopelessness? I can't remember. Could be both. They're both kind of hard to deal with. But those big feelings are particularly challenging. And in order to work through them, she recommends that we have support in some way. So that could be a therapist. It could be a loved one. It could be a pastoral counselor or a chaplain or something. Like however you get support. It could be a grief group. I know I went to a grief group, which was helpful at first. There were some boundary things that I wasn't a fan of in that particular group. So I stopped going after maybe 5 or 6 sessions, but I think that was enough even. And so with grief, you want to make sure that you are in the presence of others, because these big feelings, the ones I listed off, can be treacherous to go alone, right? To go it alone, it can be really hard. And so it's important to have support. So what happens when we don't feel our feelings? Well, first of all, they get stuck in the body. That it's not like they just go away. If you push them away, you've heard me talk about the beach ball analogy. It's like you can hold them in for a while, just like you can hold a beach ball underwater for a while. But eventually, after a lot of hard work, it's still going to breach the surface. So, and it might not show up right away. It might be, I've seen people not deal with their grief and in their 60s all of a sudden struggle. And so we want to make sure that we're working through our feelings, because otherwise they can show up in really inconvenient ways, often in the forms of like explosions or acting out or things like that, right? Alcoholism, drug use, we're just trying to cope. Not that I'm endorsing those things as like, yeah, that's a great way to cope long term. But it's what ends up happening if we don't work through the feelings. Another thing that happens, and I kind of spoke to this earlier, is we get disconnected from ourself. We get disconnected from our highest self, the core of who we are, whatever you call that, your soul, your self energy, yourself, your deep soul self, whatever your inner spirit, consciousness, we get disconnected from that. And that is no way to live. It's pretty miserable. It feels pretty lonely. It's easy to get into despair from there. But as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, if you're in that place of disconnect from your higher self, like I said, you are the light who attracts your audience to you. And so when you are disconnected from source, when you are disconnected from your highest self, your light is dimmed and you're going to have a very hard time bringing people to you. And so it's important that whatever grief you have coming up, that you're working through it. And this grief doesn't have to be, I've been talking about death, talking about divorce, breakups, whatever. But it could even be like the loss of a business, or it could be like, I don't know, like I switched audiences. I was super excited. I was working super hard with nurses. I'd had a couple years into it, spoke at this giant nursing conference, which was really cool to have that opportunity. And I was so excited to work with that population. My mom was a nurse. It was a way to honor her. My sister's a nurse. And it just wasn't happening. And I had to work through the disappointment I felt. And I would use the word grief too, although it was like, compared to the death of my mom, I'd call it grief light. But I had to work through like those feelings before I could move on and figure out what's my next step. What do I really want to do? And what can I do well? Right? So whatever your grief, it's important that you're working through it so that it's not getting in the way of you, first of all, living your life and enjoying it, but secondly, being able to attract your audience. Another thing that can happen when we are not feeling our feelings is we can start to get drained. And this is true of all feelings, but especially grief. It just wears on us like this heavy thing inside. We can even start to feel burned out, like we just, want to lay in bed and pull the covers over our head. And that's not really great for anyone. It's especially not good for someone who's self-employed, because if you lay in bed with the covers over your head, you're probably not making money, which is a problem because it's not like you can take a vacation day. And so these feelings are really important to work through for that reason as well. All right, last but not least, one of the other things I want to point out is that if our feelings, our big feelings, our grief, really any feelings, but especially bigger feelings like grief, rage, despair, helplessness, hopelessness, shame is a big one. If they're not dealt with long enough, that chronic stress of holding them wears on the body and can show up in the form of chronic illness. And I have witnessed this firsthand as a trauma therapist in my other business. I specialize in working with women with complex trauma. I never knew I would know so much about autoimmune disorders and just kind of these chronic disorders that are supposedly rare. But it was like, oh my gosh, like I know about all these things like Hashimoto's and POTS and ACS, Ehlers-Danlos, like just all these different things. And people might bite on the last one if Ehlers-Danlos is autoimmune. Anyway, whatever, right? Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Like I just know all this stuff now about these things because many of my clients with unresolved complex trauma, as they age, end up developing some kind of chronic autoimmune disease, right? There's actually some scientific evidence for this. Gabor Mate talks about it a lot. But even in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, there is a study cited, and it's only about sexual abuse, but it was that sexual abuse survivors were more likely to have an autoimmune condition. It has something to do with the HOHA ratio or something like that, so that your immune system starts attacking yourself or you instead of foreign things. And so that ratio is off in sexual abuse survivors, right? When the trauma is unresolved. And so there's actually some data. I mean, not that you should freak out, right? It's just motivation to heal stuff if you've got it, right? But there's some data that shows whether it's abuse and trauma or big feelings, if we're not working through them, we can wind up sick. So it can manifest in physical form. Okay. So we know we need to work through it. The question is how? How do we work through this? And you heard me quote Alan Wolfelt and say, grief is unique as a thumbprint. And that's the tricky part because I can't tell you how you grieve. I can tell you how I grieve. I can tell you how I've seen other people grieve. But I cannot tell you how you specifically grieve because it's really a process. I figured out how I grieve by trying different things. I'm going to tell you one thing I was super grateful for. My mom died when I was 45. I had gone to therapy first when I was like 24. And so I had been doing the work of therapy long before I was a therapist, right? I was an actuary back then. So I didn't even know what a therapist was. She had to explain it to me, which is kind of funny now. But anyway, I had already done the work of like, how do I deal with big feelings? How do I deal when things don't go the way I want to? So if you're young now, or even if you're not, because age doesn't matter, if you haven't experienced big grief, now is the time to figure out how to work with your feelings, because someday when you do experience grief, boy, I will tell you, it helped me so much. I'm not saying it was easy, but I got to believe it was easier than had I not worked through tough stuff before, had I not even known what to do with these big feelings, right? Had I not been scared or had I been scared rather of those big feelings, because I'd been working with big feelings for like 20-ish years by the time my mom died. And not just because I was a therapist, but my own, right? That's what came first before I even went to graduate school, was figuring out how do I hold space for my big feelings, because I had very, very big feelings as a highly sensitive person. And I had to figure out like, okay, well, they're not going to kill me if I feel them. And I had to have the experience of that, right? Because the thing is, in grief, sometimes you feel like the grief is going to swallow you whole. And it saved me knowing that not saved me, but helped a lot knowing that like, okay, I can cry for like an hour. I mean, I don't know, I'm usually not able to cry a full hour, but I can cry for a long time and be okay, actually feel better. Which, by the way, our tears actually have, I can't remember what chemical it is or what might not be, the chemical might not be the right word, but there's something in our tears that, and crying, that actually helps us release the stress of situations. It's one way that we can complete the stress response, right? After stressful stuff, a big hard cry is one of the things. And so crying with grief is really important. I mean, it's not going to cure the problem, like you still have the loss, but it's going to help you move it through your body so it's not getting stuck like we talked about. I will tell you, so first of all, like I said, to finish up what I was saying, if you haven't experienced a lot of bigger grief yet, now is the time to figure out, how do I hold space for my big feelings? How do I work through this? How do I trust that they're not going to swallow me whole and I'm never going to see the light of day again? Okay. The way I figured out how to work with my grief was, one, knowing how I work with feelings in the first place, but two, some of it was trial and error. It was just like, okay, I'll try this, or, oh, they said this. One of the things I do when I'm faced with a problem, and this is just how I am in the world, is a problem shows up, whether it's a client with a problem I've never seen, so I'm like, okay, or it's my mom dying, I go and read a bunch of books about it. So I read like no less than 6 books on grief. And it was all I could get myself to read, except for I did read a couple of novels. I couldn't get myself to read regular novels. So I asked people on Facebook, what are some silly, playful novels that I can, because I was having a hard time focusing because brain fog is real in grief. And with ADHD, it was like all extra. And then probably I was at the beginning of perimenopause. So my goodness, couldn't focus to save my life. But so I asked for some funny, silly books to read. So I just wouldn't sit there all the time in the hurt. And I did sit there plenty in the hurt, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But they gave me one, oh gosh, I want to say her name is like Jenny Lawson. She wrote these 2 books, and her dad is like a taxidermist. And so it's like, and she has some mental health stuff, and it's like inappropriately hilarious is how I'll describe that book, right? It was just so ridiculous to me at the time that it actually made me laugh, like literally laugh out loud. And so I read that. I think I read another one, like Agent to the Stars or something, about this like alien who comes to Earth and has a PR problem. He's like, looks like a glob or something. And so he hires like a movie star agent to like help the people of Earth appreciate him or something. I don't know. It was weird. And then I read Ready Player One, because those were some lighter books that didn't, not my usual fare, that didn't require me to be like, figuring out this plot or who's this character or following. It was just like story, beginning, middle, end, right? Not jumping around like some of the novels do nowadays, which is fascinating. When you have grief brain and you're foggy, that is like not going to work. So I read funny books. Certainly if you're not into reading, you could, I don't know if watching comedy does it for you. Taylor Tomlinson cracks me up. So there's that. But, it's finding something to balance the times when you are feeling hurt, not to push them away entirely. Remember, we want to still work with it, but to actually balance it. Then I also found that for me, those grief books really helped me sort through. One of them was a really light one. It was The Afterlife of Billy Fingers, How My Bad Boy Brother Taught Me About Life After Death. And the thing is that book specifically is about like how this, I think she was a chiropractor, connects with her brother after he dies in this really unique way. And it seems like it had to have happened, unless she's just like a big fat liar. But like it seems really real. And that really helped me right after my mom died. I also read Ian Curry's You Cannot Die, which was helpful. It's a little boring at the beginning, so it was hard at the beginning of my grief process, but it basically talks about all the way we know spirit energy goes on. So that was helpful. But then, reading those different books on grief, Alan Wolfelt, Understanding Your Grief, Megan Devine, It's Okay, You're Not Okay, or however that title goes, it's something like that. But there were a bunch of different books I read that really helped because reading is what I do. I also found, and this is something I figured out when my first cat died, my soul kitty, Allie, Um, I would write to her in a journal. Like, I just found that really helpful. And so, like, I got a journal special for my mom, and it had a sloth on the front because we used to enjoy going to Como Park, which is a zoo nearby, and they have a sloth there, and we would sit and watch it sometimes when I would come home to visit. And so this journal that I wrote to her in had a sloth on it. And so I would just write to her pretty much every day and like have a conversation with her. And I also found it helpful at the same time. I eventually added Hertz music. So Hertz it looks like Hertz, like the rental car agency, Hertz. It's pronounced Hertz. It's someone's last name in German, I believe. But anyway, it's basically music based on certain frequencies. And so I literally went on YouTube and looked for grief Hertz music. And so I would sit and listen to that as I wrote to my mom. And of course, the whole time I was sobbing. Like, it was like, for sure. I also got to help out with a memorial for my mom. So, the way we do it in Minnesota is we make these picture boards. And, my mom lived 70 years. I mean, I think she died young, but like still, she had lots of life. So in Minnesota, we take like poster boards, and then we now you have to print out photos because you don't have them all. But we printed photos and we put them all over the boards, right? We had one for her work as a nurse and all of her old coworkers and all that. We had, ones from different stages of her life, one with growing up and when my sister and I were young, and then as adults with her grandchildren. So anyway, that process was so healing because my sister and I did it together. Now, of course, if you have a family that doesn't talk to each other because of you might even have grief from that, right? But some of the dynamics that happened, then this may look different for you. You could do that yourself. It could be shared. It doesn't have to be shared, right? Could make a Shutterfly book. My mom's 70th birthday, like I said, was about 3 weeks before she died. And so I had made a video of like photographs for her 70th birthday party. And so we happened to have that. So we played that. And so watching that was actually really helpful, right? But there's lots of ways to honor your loved one. And however you do it, if you're not going to have a big memorial because they didn't want them, you can still do something yourself. And then keeping them alive in your heart is important. Like I said, I wrote to my mom every day. I also, my dad got my sister, my nieces, and I little mini urns. So this is a necklace. I also have like a little 3D heart urn, and that has her ashes in it. I have to tell you, before my mom died, I used to think it was creepy when people walked around with ashes of their loved one on their on a necklace. And now I can't imagine not having it. It's so comforting to know that she's here with me. So finding ways to keep them alive in your life. I have her picture and her other urn on my meditation altar. I've got a picture of her by my bed. And I know that there's a certain way that she talks to me. I used to just feel it like, oh my gosh, it's through the clock. Because I'm, remember a math geek. And so there's certain times when I could just feel her energy. I'd look at the clock and it would be a certain time. I'm like, could just feel her. And sure enough, when I met with an evidential medium, the one I mentioned earlier, Kim Weaver, she's like, your mom is saying she's communicating with you through the clock. Does that make sense? And I was like, yep, it does. And so there's ways that our loved ones can communicate with us. And so paying attention, how do we keep them alive in our lives? If that's something you want to do. If it was an abusive parent, you may have a different way of navigating this, right? That is how I work through my grief. And I let myself write to my mom pretty much every night for close to a year. I probably trailed off a little bit, like maybe every other night or every few nights towards the end of that year, but I found it incredibly helpful. And so that is how I did it. I've seen other people, like I also, would talk to people about it. I got back together with my therapist. I mean, I was kind of taking a break because I'd healed through the layers I needed to heal through. And so I got back into therapy. That helped me. I talked with people about it. So being in community is also helpful. And you may have your own ways. Like maybe you and your loved one really enjoyed nature. And so maybe you go on a hike and you, bring their photo in your backpack. And think of them as you look at the sky and the trees. It's unique to all of us, and it's unique for each and every loss we have. So those are some ideas of how I've worked my way through it. I know one thing that also helped me, but also one of my clients, the one who had the really big loss about 27, 28 years ago, is connecting with other people. Also, letting people know how important it is for them to remember the anniversary. So she lets people know. So I sent her a card every year on the anniversary of this big loss to let her know I'm thinking of her, right? And she has other loved ones in her life who know how much that matters to her. So she does that. She lets them know that, and then they send her cards letting her know, like, "Hey, you're in my thoughts." She also has, she's become a grief speaker, written a book on grief, and so she, eventually found her way to some of that meaning making, right? But that doesn't mean the grief isn't still there. So, okay, I think that's all I have for you. There's so much more I could say about this, and I just wanna emphasize, like, take what works for you from this, discard the rest. Each of our relationships with the loss and grief itself is different. And so your process of moving through it is different. And so my heart is with you as you navigate whatever grief or loss you're facing right now or will face in the future. Take care.